Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to continue now where we left off yesterday in the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. We're talking about Pope Pius VII and his reestablishment of the Jesuit order by a papal bull. Pope Pius VII, restoring the Jesuit order just 41 years after Pope Clement XIV, who was also, just as Pope Pius VII, declared to be divine and infallible, suppressed the Jesuits and abolished them everywhere forever. This contradiction between two popes is proof of the lack of infallibility of this so-called papacy that declares itself to be the vicar and the replacement of the Son of God on earth. Look, this phony man-made organization cannot survive without the Jesuits. The papacy knows that. I believe even Pope Clement XIV knew that, and he was simply doing what most popes do when they have their mitre in a wringer. They do what is expedient. And during the reign of Pope Clement XIV, all of Europe was outraged at the Jesuits, and they wanted them suppressed. Clement XIV took that opportunity to suppress the Jesuit order, but in fact he just spread Jesuitism all over the world. When the Jesuits were suppressed, they went underground, and they insinuated themselves in nations not Roman Catholic, Russia and the United States. And here we have Pope Pius VII, only 41 years later, publicly and with a papal bull, reestablishing the Jesuit order. Now this is, as R.W. Thompson tells us, the reestablishment of the Jesuits by Pope Pius VII is one of the most powerful elements in history, one of the most important elements of history, and that we cannot understand current events without our understanding of what role the Jesuits have played since their reestablishment. Now, R.W. Thompson begins at the top of page 248 if you're following along. He said, "We should glance, therefore, at the condition of the European nations at the time of Pope Pius VII, in order to penetrate his motives and comprehend what he must have regarded as the necessity which influenced him in aiding the Jesuits to cast reproach upon the memory of Pope Clement XIV, one of the most meritorious of his predecessors." So says R.W. Thompson. Now he begins a discussion about the French Revolution. We're going to try to discover what influence was upon Pope Pius VII to restore the Jesuit order. And the first order of discussion for R.W. Thompson in those regards is the French Revolution. It was a key element for Pope Pius VII in the reestablishment of the Jesuit order. He says the French Revolution had made the attempt, in imitation of the example of the United States, to scatter the germs of popular representative government throughout Europe. He credits the French Revolution of attempting to spread popular representative forms of government throughout Europe, much like the government of the United States. And it says, "Whatsoever errors sprang out of that great movement are attributable more to the pre-existing influences and prejudices of false education, and to the aid which monarchism derived from the ill-fated union of church and state, than to all other causes combined. When the European states became convulsed by this event, the Jesuits seized upon the opportunity to persuade the reigning sovereigns that the support of their society as organized by Ignatius Loyola was absolutely necessary to the preservation and continuance of the principles of monarchy, and that without their cooperation, the people who were incapable of conducting the affairs of government would triumph over kings. Okay, so the Jesuit rationale was that if popular forms of government spread throughout the world, there will be chaos because the people are not able to govern. They don't have the wherewithal to govern. And it will also render extinct the monarchical system. Okay? And just remember that that monarchical system is justified through the papacy, the divine right monarch of the world. And that all these other monarchs that enjoyed their power and influence and pleasure and wealth and prestige and honor ultimately comes from the papacy. Okay, all monarchism evolves from the papacy. Now, the Jesuits had an easy job of scaring or frightening the monarchs of Europe over the spread of popular forms of government. They were facing extinction if popular forms of government became the new world order, right? So they had to ally themselves. It says, when the European states became convulsed by this event, the French Revolution, the Jesuits seized upon the opportunity to persuade the reigning sovereigns that the support of their society, the Jesuit order, as organized by Ignatius Loyola, was absolutely necessary to the preservation and continuance of the principle of monarchy, and that without their cooperation, the people, who were incapable of conducting the affairs of government, would triumph over kings. They assailed liberalism in every form, from the French encyclopedists to the humblest advocate of popular government, consigning all of them to eternal tortures for venturing to assert the natural right of mankind to civil and religious liberty. This was congenial work for them, the Jesuits and these monarchs, for although not yet reestablished, they felt assured that if they could excite the fear of the sovereigns at the probable loss of their royal authority, they would thereby set in operation a current of influences which would soon reach Pope Pius VII and lead him to disregard the decree of the abolition of the Jesuits and to cast his lot along with the other kings, whatsoever event might be produced upon the fortunes of the Roman Catholic Church. Ignatius Loyola had founded the Jesuit order upon the plea of its necessity to counteract the influences of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. And now in the 19th, the same argument was repeated, so varied only as to embrace all the existing fruits of the Reformation, including the right of the people to self-government. The Jesuits did not miscalculate. They knew how to excite both the fears and the bigotry of the sovereigns. They understood Pope Pius VII and succeeded at last in obtaining from him the decree for their reestablishment, by virtue of which they have since existed and are now scattered throughout all the nations, with neither their ambition nor their thirst for power in the least degree slackened. Everybody at all familiar with history understands how necessary it was considered that the Allied powers to recast the history of Europe after the escape of Napoleon from the island of Elba. For this purpose, their representatives assembled at the Congress of Vienna and took to themselves the name of the Holy Alliance, which, according to Prince Metternich, who was its leading spirit, was induced by, quote, the overflow of the pietistic feeling of the Emperor Alexander of Russia and the application of Christian principles to politics. In other words, a union of religious and political liberal ideas, a union of church and state. Now, this effort on the part of the monarchists of Europe was designed to give renewed prominence to the idea that kings governed by divine right. In other words, to establish the union between church and state so completely that it could never be again disturbed. It was intended to teach the people that all the liberties they were entitled to possess were such only as the governing monarchs deemed it expedient to grant them, that they were entitled to none whatsoever by virtue of the natural law, that the attempt to establish representative and liberal government like that of the United States was an unpardonable sin against God, and that the highest duty of citizenship was obedience to the monarchical authority. Did you get that? They said that representative and liberal governments like that of the United States was an unpardonable sin against God. Now, I ask my listeners, what God are they referring to? Obviously, the God of the Pope. All right? That's who all this is designed to protect, the papacy, the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, and his spiritual and temporal power upon the earth. This Congress of Vienna, the gathering of all the divine right monarchs of Europe in a holy alliance with the papacy, reestablishing the authority of the Jesuits. They are literally waging war against the Protestant Reformation and all the forms of popular government that sprang forth from the Protestant Reformation. This is a huge alliance of the monarchs of Europe together with the papacy and the militia of the Pope, those who are sworn a bloody oath to destroy the Protestant Reformation and every form of government that sprang out of it and restore monarchism in the world. They have allied themselves and they are declaring war against Protestantism and all liberal forms of government. This is a huge event in history, and it is ignored by historians, the importance of this. They did not want governments such as the United States that reflected Protestant tenets. They did not want that form of government. The government of, by, and for the people who are the vessels of the Holy Spirit, who have the written Word of God and who have God's law written upon their heart, are not qualified to govern according to these monarchs. That their possession of the Holy Spirit and the Scriptures and an inherent love and obedience to Christ are not qualified to govern. And that representative forms of government, the governments erected by the will of the people, are an assault against the throne of Almighty God. And that only monarchism should reign in the world. And that the people should have no rights but what the monarchs, the papists, say they should have. And whatever is convenient or expedient to these monarchs. And that these rights and liberties, whenever they are granted, may be withdrawn at their whim. That the people are not to govern, but that the people ought to be governed. That is monarchism. And it's only successful when there is a union of church and state. So when you see the union of church and state like we see here in the United States of America, there's only one conclusion. They're trying to restore monarchism in this country. I attest to my listeners, my best observations indicate that church and state have long been united in this United States of America. That now the church and the state are sacrosanct and cannot be criticized without bringing all kinds of persecution down upon your head. It used to be a time in this country when it was our duty to examine the government and criticize and petition the government for redress and grievances. But nowadays, the government is monarchical in form. It does not respond to the will of the people. It lies to the people, and it's taking our rights away. And we have the ecumenical movement that unites both Roman Catholics and Protestants, evangelicals of every stripe, under one gigantic geopolitical organization that is literally controlling Washington, D.C., and all under the direction of the Jesuit order. So we have the Jesuits running through the halls of government, together with the Roman Catholic priests and prelates, who claim that they represent not only the Roman Catholics in this country, but also the evangelicals. And they demand that our government make this a Christian society, which is not Christian at all, but Roman Catholic. And if it be Roman Catholic, it is, by definition, monarchical. All right, this attempt to restore monarchism happened concurrently with the convention of the Congress of Vienna and the monarchs of Europe, together with the papacy and the restoration of the Jesuits. And all according to this historian as a response to the French Revolution. That the French Revolution so upheaved Europe that it was enough to excite the monarchies to unite against liberalism. Now, while the French Revolution had many, many errors in it, it did open the door for the spread of representative forms of government. I'm not a defender of the French Revolution per se, but I'm simply pointing out, as is R.W. Thompson, what effect the French Revolution had upon Pope Pius VII and upon the monarchs, the papal monarchs of Europe, and the eventual restoration of the Jesuits and their increase in power here in the United States, all for the purpose of destroying representative government. He says it was intended to teach the people that all the liberties they were entitled to possess were such only as the governing monarchs deemed it expedient to grant them, that they were entitled to none whatsoever by virtue of the natural law, that the attempt to establish representative and liberal government like that of the United States was an unpardonable sin against God, and that the highest duty of citizenship was obedience to monarchical authority, that is, papal authority. Now, not the least conspicuous among the maneuvering sovereigns and politicians of Europe at this time was Pope Pius VII, who felt himself to be the most illustrious and important representative of the divine right of kings. Okay, R.W. Thompson is confirming what I assert, that the whole topic of the divine right of kings literally springs from the papacy. If there is no papacy, then there's no foundation upon which to build monarchies. The Pope declares himself to be the divine right ruler of the world, and he simply shares that divine right with any monarch who will step up to the plate and impose his will upon the people. And they share with him the divine right. They can attest to themselves that they have God's sanction to govern, because they govern at the will of the Pope, who is the representative of Christ on earth, the replacement of Christ on earth, and therefore they are sacrosanct. Church and state are united, both being now sacrosanct. The church is always sacrosanct beyond the criticism of the people, because it is divinely instituted. But when the state comes in union with the church, it shares that sanctity. It becomes sacrosanct just like the church. And that's how the papacy rules the world. How he said he hated Napoleon, that is, Pope Pius VII, hated Napoleon intensely for no other reason because, quote, the little Corsican, unquote, had arrested and held him in confinement. In casting about to discover by what means he, as Pope, could render the most conspicuous aid to the cause of monarchism and the suppression of liberal and popular government, he naturally turned to the direction of the Jesuits, whose fidelity to the principle of absolutism was vouched for by the constitution of their society and their intense devotion to the memory of Ignatius Loyola. He accordingly, whilst the monarchs were preparing for the Congress of Vienna, and only a few months before its assembling, anticipated their action by reestablishing the Society of the Jesuits. His prompt action commended him to the Allied sovereigns, who could not have failed to see in it sufficient to assure them his hostility to popular government and his fidelity to the monarchical cause. So the sovereigns of Europe instantly recognized that when Pope Pius VII reestablished the Jesuit order, he was against popular government, because the defining characteristic of the Jesuit order is a warfare against popular government, against all forms of government that find their root in the Protestant Reformation. So simply by restoring the Jesuits, the Pope set a signal to every monarch in Europe. This is war, and we intend to win it. And all popular forms of government are going to be destroyed. It says his prompt action, that Pope Pius VII's restoration of the Jesuits, his prompt action to restore the Jesuits, commended him to the Allied sovereigns, who could not have failed to see in it the restoration of the Jesuits sufficient to assure them of his hostility to popular government and his fidelity to the monarchical cause. His purpose may be inferred from the language of his decree. He declared that he should be derelict in his duty, quote, if placed in the bark of Peter, tossed and assailed by continual storms, he refused to employ the vigorous and experienced rowers, that is, the Jesuits, who volunteered their service in order to break the waves of the sea which threatened every moment shipwreck and death, unquote. Simply acknowledging that the ship of the papacy was destined for shipwreck if he did not reinstitute the Jesuits. The papacy cannot survive without those experienced and vigorous rowers, the Jesuits, steering and propelling the church to her prophetic destiny. We've come up on the break. We'll be back right after the messages. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Stay tuned.
$100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left-behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back from the break. We're going to continue now where we left off before. This is Pope Pius VII, a comment that he made during his restoration of the Jesuits in 1773. He declared that he should be derelict in his duty if placed in the bark of Peter, tossed and assailed by continual storms. He refused to employ the vigorous and experienced rowers of the Jesuits, who volunteered their services in order to break the waves of a sea which threatened every moment shipwreck and death. He mentions the bark of Peter. I want my listeners to understand what is meant by this phrase, the bark of Peter. We're talking about the ship of state. We're talking about the temporal power of the Pope. We're not talking about his spiritual power. I think I have a more clear connection this time. We're talking about this quote by Pope Pius VII. Quoting here, he says, if placed in the bark of Peter, in other words, if placed in the ship of state. We're talking about the temporal power of the Pope, his temporal jurisdiction as a monarch, a global monarch. If placed in that ship of state, tossed and assailed by continual storms, he refused to employ the vigorous and experienced rowers of the Jesuits, his temporal power would be destroyed. Monarchy would be destroyed. He would be derelict in his duty as the divine right king of the world if he did not employ the Jesuits to row and to steer that ship of state. And that same ship of state that is rowed and steered by the Jesuits, carrying the divine right monarch of the world, also carries his assistants, the monarchical kings of Europe. And he would be derelict in his duty if he did not reestablish the Jesuit order. Now, what did he mean? What did he mean by the storms that tossed and assailed the bark of Peter, the temporal power of the Pope? The governments were agitated by political and military turmoil. But these things were not within the rightful province of the Church or the Pope. The Church was at peace, except insofar as Pope Pius VII had voluntarily chosen to mix himself up with the political struggles of kings in order to preserve his own temporal crown. That he intended to become an active party to these struggles is proved by all that he said and did, even by the language of his decree. In explaining his action, he says that Ferdinand, king of Sicily, had requested the reestablishment of the Jesuits because it was necessary that they should be employed as instructors, quote, informing youth to Christian piety and fear of God, unquote. All right. They must be reinstituted. The Jesuits must be reinstituted to educate the children and to fit them for a Christian society. And their definition of a Christian society is Roman Catholicism and a union of church and state, a government controlled by the church. Okay? If children are raised with Protestant tenets, then they are naturally raised with a paradigm where church and state are separated. Render unto Caesar, the temporal power, that which is Caesar's, and render unto God, the spiritual power, those things that are God's. The separation of church and state is written in the Bible. That's what is Protestantism. Biblical teaching, biblical understanding, a separation of church and state. That does not work in the Antichrist system. Okay, the Antichrist system demands a union of church and state, monarchism, and they claim it by divine right. Obviously, they don't get that divine right from God or from the Scriptures. They get it from Satan himself. Okay, this is Antichrist speaking here. Now, the author continues, he says, Ferdinand was one of the most bigoted kings and thorough monarchists in Europe. And his idea of Christian piety and fear of God was that it centered in the divine right of kings and the union of church and state. With him, religion and monarchism were synonymous terms. If he sometimes made small concessions to his subjects for fear of the popular wrath, they were always withdrawn when his power became strong enough to enable him to renew his oppressions with impunity. He acted upon the Jesuit principle that a monarchical sovereign is not bound by any promise he makes to his subjects, for the reason that the latter, the subjects, have no rights which the former, the monarch, are bound to recognize. And if they had, that the Pope could release him from the obligation to obey his promise, a doctrine then strictly adhered to so as to make popular institutions impossible. See what the whole purpose of this is? To make popular forms of government impossible. His main purpose was to perpetuate his own temporal and political authority, and he desired to employ the Jesuits for that purpose, well knowing that their doctrines were expressly designed to hold society in obedience to monarchism, union of church and state. You just have to realize that monarchism and the union of church and state are synonymous terms. One cannot exist without the other. For monarchism to be successful, there must be a union of church and state. And this is why we see the Pope John Paul II, in the 80s, 1983 or 1986, I can't remember which, invited all the religions of the world to come to Assisi and worship with him, as though they were all worshiping the same God together, uniting all the world's religions. At the same time, the Vatican is vigorously working to unite all the governments of the world into one global government. We're talking about a global union of church and state and a global monarchy, headed up by the papacy, headed up by the Jesuits. And here we have today, for the first time in world history, a Jesuit priest occupying the so-called Bark of Peter. Now, R.W. Thompson is not a prophet. R.W. Thompson simply examined history and came up with the correct answer, and we know it's correct by what we see as facts on the ground today. R.W. Thompson is a reliable predictor of what the Jesuits will accomplish, because he predicted what we see today in the world. Now it says Pope Pius VII did not hesitate to avow his sympathy with Ferdinand, and in doing so proved that he was influenced by the same temporal and political motives. Okay? Church and state, matters of church and state, they motivate all the monarchs, all the divine writers, especially the papacy, the fountain of the divine right of kings. He considered it necessary that the crown of absolute sovereignty should be kept upon the head of Ferdinand in order to assure himself that it should be kept also upon his own. The sovereigns of the Holy Alliance had massed large armies and soon entered into a pledge to devote those armies to the suppression of all the uprisings of the people in favor of free government. And he desired to devote the Jesuits, supported by his pontifical power, to the accomplishment of that end. He knew how faithfully the Jesuits would apply themselves to that work, and hence he counseled them in his decree of restoration to strictly observe, quote, the useful advices and salutary counsels, unquote, whereby Ignatius Loyola had made absolutism the cornerstone of the society. So the fountain of this global monarchy is dependent upon the Jesuits. And that's why it should raise the hair on the neck of every Bible-believing Protestant in this country, that the Jesuits are so free to operate in this country, this Protestant nation, this nation that has the popular government, sprung forth from the Protestant Reformation. These Jesuits, who are sworn to destroy Protestantism and all popular forms of government like that of the United States, to destroy that all over the world and replace it with monarchism, papal monarchism. It should be a nightmarish thing as perceived by the American people of these Jesuits so freely operating in this country, where they've been kicked out of every other nation in the world for these very things. Why the United States tolerates the Jesuits in anywhere in this country is beyond comprehension. It's only because of their ignorance. And the Jesuits have hidden their history from our eyes. And our government has supported this cloak that they've thrown over the history of the Jesuits. And our churches have failed to bring this knowledge to our understanding. Our churches have failed us. Our government has failed us. Why? Because the Jesuits have influenced both the governments, the schools, and the churches. Just like they did in all the other countries for which they were evicted. The Jesuits are only successful where the people are ignorant. When the people are educated about the Jesuits are forced to flee. The Jesuits flee when no one pursues them. Simply when the people begin to understand what the Jesuit order is all about. You want to put the Jesuits on the run? Educate everybody within your realm of influence about the history of the Jesuits. This book should be on the coffee table of every God-fearing, Bible-believing Protestant in this country, every Roman Catholic in this country, and every citizen. Our country is destroyed for lack of knowledge. And isn't it amazing? One of my regular listeners, whose name I won't mention, emailed me the other day. She said, Tom, you just love your books. But in Ecclesiastes, it warns about reading many books. This country loves ignorance. And I am going to keep reading my books until Christ comes home, educating as many people as will listen to me. R.W. Thompson knows the fate of this country if it does not wake up to the influence of the Roman Catholic Church within our shores, and the role that the Jesuits will play in this new world order. I will not be defeated by one criticism by an ignorant listener. Continue with the book, page 252 at the top. It says, thus the motives of Pope Pius VII are clearly shown to have been temporal and political, and when he excused himself on account of the deplorable times, that is, the political disturbance among the nations, he manifestly had in view the advancement of those plottings against popular liberty, which soon furnished the rallying point of the Holy Alliance at Vienna. He seemed to have been so intent upon this subject as not to realize that he owed at least some show of respect to the memory of Pope Clement XIV, who suppressed the Jesuits, as if unconscious that when the latter abolished the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, he also was the head of the Roman Catholic Church, possessed of all the powers and prerogatives of a lawfully elected pope. He abrogated and annulled his decree as if it had possessed no higher dignity than a municipal ordinance, imitating in this the practice of those sovereigns who brushed all impediments out of the paths of their ambitions. He conferred upon the Jesuits the right to exist as an order throughout the world, and thereby approved and endorsed their vilification of Pope Clement XIV. And to show his own estimate of the plenitude of his pontifical authority, he declared that his decree of restoration should be, quote, inviolably observed, unquote, and that it should, quote, never be submitted to the judgment or revision of any judge, unquote. And then, as if he stood in the place of God, whilst Pope Clement XIV had rebelled against the divine authority, he commanded that, quote, no one be permitted to infringe or by any audacious temerity to oppose any part of his decree, and made disobedience to it an act of sin by declaring that he should be guilty, that who shall be guilty of it, quote, will therefore incur the indignation of Almighty God and the holy apostles Peter and Paul, unquote. So anybody that clamors for the suppression of the Jesuits again, after Pope Pius VII restored them by a papal bull, the indignation of Almighty God and the apostles Peter and Paul should be upon his head. That's right. As if Pope Pius VII could call down the wrath of God and the wrath of Peter and Paul. I'm a Protestant. The Pope can't command God in any respect. Pope Pius VII treated contemptuously the decree of Clement XIV without the least pretense that the Jesuits had repented of the crimes for which he abolished their society after 4 years of careful investigation, and without any pledge upon their part not to repeat them, a serious and dangerous omission. I say it was an intentional omission. If Pope Pius XIV had suppressed the Jesuit order, there had to be a reason. And Pope Pius VII, upon reestablishing the Jesuit order, should have reviewed those reasons and put limitations upon the Jesuits. But Pope Pius VII didn't want any limitations placed on the Jesuits. That's the fact. Again, I see all of this as an attempt not to suppress the Jesuits, but to give them an opportunity to expand their area of operations. Never forget that the papacy was established upon the divine right to rule the world. If that global conquest ever becomes stagnant, then the goal is in jeopardy. After the Protestant Reformation, that advancement was not only stagnated, it was reversing. The Jesuits had to expand their area of operations. And the suppression of the Jesuits and their reinstitution was simply an opportunity for them to expand their area of operations. R.W. Thompson gives us plenty of reasons to believe that they did expand their area of operations, and particularly here in the United States, as much or more as they expanded their area of operations in Russia. Now, continuing the top of page 253, if you're following along, he says, one cannot refrain from wondering why Pope Pius VII did not pause long enough to inquire, quote, upon what meat does this our Caesar feed, that he has grown so great, unquote. What source of pontifical authority existed in his behalf that did not also exist in behalf of Pope Clement XIV? The one was no more pope than the other, no more infallible than the other, possessed no higher official prerogatives than the other. They were equals in power and official dignity. If Pope Clement XIV had suspended the society, in other words, for a time, then it would have been within the power of Pope Pius VII to set aside the suspension and revive the society. But he went further. Pope Clement XIV went further than that. It was not just a suspension. He went further than that in the most emphatic and express terms, suppressed, abolished, annulled, and extinguished the Jesuit order forever. His official act was valid, complete, and final, in compliance with the Roman Catholic canon law and established customs of the Church. The society, therefore, had no legal existence according to the law of the Church, but was dead and extinct when Pope Pius VII became Pope. Its constitution, the Jesuit order's constitution, was then a nullity, and he had rightfully only the power possessed by Pope Paul III when he first established the Jesuit Society in 1540, and by exercising this power could have organized a new society and granted it a new constitution. Instead of this, Pope Pius VII re-established the defunct society at the request of King Ferdinand, thereby assuming the prerogative right to review and annul what Pope Clement XIV had done within the scope of his legitimate authority. In order to do this, he had further to assume that Pope Clement XIV had exceeded his authority and had acted injuriously toward the Roman Catholic Church by depriving it of, quote, the vigorous and experienced rowers, that is, the Jesuits, necessary to save it from shipwreck and death. This was, in effect, to approve the Jesuit defamations of Pope Clement XIV and to deny his papal infallibility. It was, moreover, an implied approval of the rebellion of the Jesuits against the authority of the Church during the 41 years that had elapsed after the abolition of the society. It was an attempt to cover up, sanction, and legitimate that rebellion, and to reward the Jesuit order for its persistent defiance of the Church and the Roman Catholic canon law by galvanizing its dead body into life. The Jesuits themselves are sensible of this difficulty and are perplexed by it. In dealing with it, the historian for the Jesuits, Dorignac, displays more ingenuity than candor. Referring to the existence of the Jesuits in White Russia after the decree of abolition and in violation of it, he ventures to say, quote, "The position of the Jesuits in White Russia was an anomaly." An anomaly. Pope Clement XIV had authorized them to remain in status quo, says Dorignac. Pope Clement XIV authorized them to remain in status quo? I didn't read that in what has been represented by this bull of Pope Clement XIV. They were abolished and extinguished forever, everywhere. No exception. And he says the historian Dorignac fails to give any authority for this, for the obvious reason that there is none. Nothing can be found to verify it. It is undoubtedly of Jesuit manufacture, being contradicted by everything done and said by Pope Clement XIV. The language of his decree is conclusive upon the point that his object was to destroy the Jesuit order and put an end to it forever, not allowing it to exist anywhere. He makes neither exception nor reservation. Any other pretense is a palpable perversion of his meaning. Dorignac manifestly realized this difficulty and made an additional effort to escape it by attempting to impair the official force and effect of the decree of abolition. He says elsewhere, quote, "In view of the future, he, that is Pope Clement XIV, would not suppress the society by a bull which would be binding upon his successors. He had suppressed it by a brief which could be revoked without difficulty whenever public feeling might allow it," unquote. So in order to substantiate all his claims, he simply says it wasn't a bull, it was a brief. Okay? It wasn't the thunder from the throne of Peter, the voice of Almighty God. No, it was like a municipal ordinance. See how Jesuitical that is?
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.